I'm Jim Claypool, and welcome to this edition of Northern Lights. One of the joys of being associated with a university campus is the fact that you come into contact with many, many interesting people. People who stretch across the widest varieties of experiences and backgrounds, and you find that to be true on the faculty and the staff, with the student body, and of course as we touch out into the community, the people that come here on campus and participate. But one of the really fine and unique examples of extraordinary people here on campus is the chair of the Literature and Language Department, and an old friend of mine who we've known each other for a long time, and he's my special guest today. It's Dr. Danny Miller. Danny, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you very much.
Danny, you've had a long association with the university, but before we get to that, I want to say something about your background. You were originally born in West Virginia, in McDowell County, West Virginia?
Yes. I was born in McDowell County, West Virginia. Excuse me. My grandparents had come from North Carolina, and my grandfather, Miller, was a coal miner in West Virginia at that time, and my father was also a coal miner at the time when I was born, and in 1949. And my grandmother and grandfather Miller had come from North Carolina to West Virginia in the 1930s. My mother was from North Carolina, and my father was also from North Carolina, but they were living in West Virginia when I was born in 1949. And in a way, I mean, I feel very much like a child of Appalachia, because I was from the mountains of North Carolina, the mountains of West Virginia. Although I also traveled around a great deal because my father was in the Navy. When I was about 4 years old, my father joined the Navy, or actually rejoined the Navy, because he had been in the Navy in 1944 and 1945, and then and he had rejoined the Navy when I was about 3 or 4 years old in 53 or 54. And then he was a career man in the Navy for 25 years, and so he traveled a great deal. He was on ships a lot. He had around-the-world cruises. He had 6-month cruises. And we lived in many different places along the coast: Charleston, South Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, and Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So we traveled around a lot, so I feel like my background is very mixed. There was a lot of that growing up on the East Coast in naval towns, but then there was a lot of going back and forth to the mountains of North Carolina and West Virginia.
You brought some pictures of your father, showing him working in the Navy, and then some other pictures. I think did he end up in Vietnam at one point? My
father had a very long career in the Navy. He was as a teenager, when he was about 16, he joined the Navy during World War II. And my father actually served in World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam War. And he never really talked much about any of that. I had to sit him down and talk to him about those things whenever I was very interested in his life, trying to find out more about his life. He had sort of run away from home in a way as a teenager, and joined the Navy to begin with. He was only 16. He lied about his age. He got into the service. I remember one of the things that he told me, one of the few things that he ever told me about his career in the Pacific during World War II, was that he was on one ship where the ship was bombed and almost everyone on the ship died. They just were killed all around him, and he escaped. He also talked about being on a ship, or being on an island in the Pacific when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He said that the sailors on this island, they felt the earth tremble a little, and they could see a bright light in the sky, but they did not know what had happened until much later, when they were told that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. But Daddy also, I mean, that was in World War II, and then later he served in the Korean War, and then when I was in high school, and actually my first year or two of college in the 1960s, Daddy served in Vietnam. He was on a ship, on a small boat that patrolled the Mekong Delta. And some of those pictures that we are showing are just pictures that I have had in scrapbooks of things. I have a few letters that he wrote back to us, and these pictures, I mean, he's not in these pictures of these sort of village scenes of Vietnam. He is in a couple of those other scenes, but like this one where there's just children down in one corner and some American soldiers on a boat there. Daddy isn't in any of those pictures. I don't know if he even took them, or they were just may have been postcard type pictures.
I'm glad you got to talk about that, because that highlights probably one of the great interests of your life, and that is where you came from, your family, your genealogy, your origins. And I often tell my class, how do you know where you're going unless you knew where you came from? So I guess you've looked into where the Millers came from, and I also, as you talk about this interest, I want you to talk about probably the most interesting part of your family. You have a relative, some cousins that were married. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather's first cousin was married to some pretty famous people, and you might want to comment on that, Danny.
Well, I am very interested in genealogy. It is my biggest hobby, I would say. I've spent thousands, millions of hours researching family and history, the genealogy, who my ancestors were, where they came from. I've often wondered why I'm so interested. Why should anyone be interested in their family and their genealogy? A lot of people I know say that doesn't interest me in the least. I don't care who they were or where they came from. For me, it's, and I've thought about it, partly I think it was because as I was growing up, we were separated from the mountains, from those people back home in the mountains. We were on the coast, and I think that I felt a sense of separation from that I've wanted to get back, that I've wanted to, feel that I, more closer to the family. Also, I'm very interested in history. I just think that history tells us who we are and where we have been, and plus it's just fascinating. These stories. And so I've done a great deal of genealogical research, and the one connection that you mentioned, when you get into genealogy, you either find that you're related to somebody really famous, like the president or a king or something. Everybody wants to go back to the British royal family or something, or you discover that you're related to a horse thief or something like that. Sort of the skeletons in the closet. Well, my grandmother, my mother's mother, her maiden name was Yates, Yates. And the Yates family has always intrigued me. They have a lot of similar characteristics from generation to generation and within families. And when I began to research the Yates family, one of the first things I discovered was that my grandmother's great-great-grandfather was a first cousin to the wives of the original Siamese twins. This was Sarah and Adelaide Yates, who were the wives of Chang and Ing Bunker, the original Siamese twins. I'm from, in North Carolina, where my family is from, Ashe County, North Carolina, borders Wilkes County, North Carolina. And it was to Wilkes County, North Carolina, that Chang and Ing came in the 40s, or maybe even 50s. In the late 1840s, they came to Wilkes County, North Carolina, to Wilkesboro, where they met these two sisters, Sarah and Adelaide Yates, and courted them. This was very unusual, and the people of Wilkesboro were very surprised, let's say, and in fact, often, in many ways, disapproved. Although I have heard it said that the people of Wilkesboro disapproved more of the fact that the Siamese twins were Oriental than that they were Siamese twins, that they were, freaks or sideshow attractions, because at that time there was a great deal of prejudice against the Oriental.
Well, it had to do with the building of the railroad and all of that sort of xenophobia that was associated.
Exactly. But they became very well respected. The twins became very well respected in the Wilkes and Surrey County area. They married the sisters, Sarah and Adelaide Yates, and they ended up having one twin and his wife had 10 children. The other twin and his wife had 11 children. And so this has always been one of the fascinating aspects of the lives of the Siamese twins.
There's all kinds of thoughts that race through my mind, all in the family, and
well, yes,
and maybe an Archie Bunker situation.
Well,
where,
yes,
Danny, we're going to take a break here in just a few moments, but you are one of the most dynamic teachers and certainly one of the most dynamic people on this campus. Have you always been this way? Has this always been part of your character?
Well, Jim, thank you very much. I can only say that I feel enthusiastic about teaching, and I've loved teaching, and also, and I'm not just saying this because we're on a TV show about Northern, but I love teaching at Northern. Northern is a wonderful place, and I feel very, very fortunate to be here.
In many ways, I think when I think about your career and what I know about you and what we're going to talk about here in a few moments, Northern seems to be the culmination of something you've been building up to all your life.
It's very interesting. I think that in many ways, what happens in one's life is serendipitous. If I could have chosen my life, I would not have been any different than what it is now, but I don't feel as if I've really in many ways chosen it. A lot of things have happened. When I started here teaching at Northern, I started as a part-time instructor 20 years ago while I was finishing my degree at UC. I figured that I would get my degree and would apply for jobs and would go wherever I was taken. I continued to work at Northern, and for 6 years in non-tenure track position, hoping that I would get a job, finally would get a full-time job at Northern, because I loved it so much here, and I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're going to take a break here in just a moment and continue on what prepared you to bring you here to Northern Kentucky University in the current position that you hold. Stay with us now. We want to take a brief break. We'll be back in just a few moments. Hello, I'm Jim Claypool, and welcome back to Northern Lights. I'm glad you could stay with us. And, of course, we're talking today to Danny Miller, the head of the Language and Literature Department here at Northern Kentucky University, and one of the most dynamic figures here on campus. And I've set you up, Danny. I've got you all set up to show the audience how intellectual you are and how dynamic you are.
How dynamic I am,
and how
yes,
personable
right.
you are. Now, don't disappoint us, but let's talk a little bit about your experiences educationally. And you went to one of the most unique institutions in this country, Berea College, and tell us something about how you got there and what that was like.
Yes, Jim, I did, and I feel very fortunate to have attended Berea College. As I mentioned earlier, my father was in the Navy. At that time, I'm not really quite sure what his yearly salary was. I think it was less than $20,000 a year. That was in the late 60s. In 1967 is when I entered Berea College. And Berea was founded before the Civil War by abolitionists. John G. Fee, an abolitionist minister from Oberlin, Ohio, came south and founded Berea College. And Berea's motto is God hath made of one blood all nations of the earth. And Berea was founded on abolitionist principles, and the students who were attracted to Berea were African American students and Appalachian students. And Berea has always had a mission to those two groups, African Americans and Appalachians. And at Berea, and even, this was even before the Civil War that Berea educated African American students. And Berea has had a history of coexisting education of African Americans and white students since before the Civil War. The only time that wasn't in effect was during the time of the Day laws in Kentucky, when it was forbidden to educate the African Americans and whites together. But Berea has a wonderful background and a wonderful history. At Berea, students do not pay tuition. They only pay room and board. And in order to help pay for the room and board, students work. Everyone works at least 10 hours. It's interesting, in the years before I went to Berea, the students worked in places like they milked cows, they farmed, they even grew tobacco, and Berea sold tobacco. By the time I came to Berea in the late 60s, they did not have a farm anymore, and no one worked on the farm. No one milked cows. It was cheaper to buy the milk, already pasteurized and everything, than it was to go through all of the milking and all of that at Berea. But students worked in many other areas, including craft areas. This has become Berea's sort of claim to fame, the Berea crafts, so that students worked in weaving. They would weave cloth for napkins or tablecloths or things like that. Students worked in lapidary, making jewelry, etc. Students worked in wood making. They would make foosball games and tables, and so a great deal of the craft industry at Berea is done by students. Students also worked in the manual labor. I, for example, for 2 years as a student at Berea, I served breakfast. I got up at 5:30 every morning and would go to the cafeteria, where I would pour cans of juice and cut fruit to put out for students who came through for breakfast. After 2 years of doing that, I sort of graduated up to being a student assistant for a faculty person at Berea. That was Miss Dorothy Tredenick, the chair of the art department. And so I worked for her, grading papers, helping put things out on tables, displays, and that kind of thing. But when I graduated from Berea College, after 4 years, I owed $300.
Hard to believe. When you think about it, and of course, for those who are not familiar with it, Berea is about 40 minutes south of Lexington down I-75, and of course, famed for the tavern there and the spoon bread and the wonderful service and food that you get there. But what I want to get at is, it must have been while you were there at Berea that you refocused or accentuated your interest in Appalachian, its history, and its literature. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is exactly right. Berea is one of the major centers of Appalachian studies in the Appalachian region. And I took my first course in Appalachian literature at Berea and I was taught by a woman named Maureen Faulkner, who was a wonderful teacher. And the course that I took in Appalachian literature, we had as a visitor to the class Wilma Dykeman, who is one of the great Appalachian writers. And so I became very much interested in Appalachian literature and in Appalachian culture at that time. And I have always been very proud of that background. here in Cincinnati, of course, and in the greater Cincinnati area, there's a great urban Appalachian population. And every year there's the Appalachian Festival that is sponsored by the Appalachian Community Development Association. There's the Urban Appalachian Council that is an advocacy organization for Appalachians in this area. And being in this area is very interesting because there is this large Appalachian population. But one of my great interests has been on Appalachian literature, and I have focused on a lot of the Appalachian writers in my work.
It's been said that to produce great literature, and incidentally the South and the Appalachian region in general is famous for having done so, you have to have a passion. You have to have an identity, you have to have an association with the land, with the people, with the character. And I can think of very few places in America that provide such a variety and such a setting. Whether you're looking at West Virginia and you're looking at feuds or coal, or you're looking at Kentucky, you're looking at the gentry or the Civil War or whatever it might happen to be. So there is such a fertile ground here, and this has helped capture your imagination. And what I really want to ask as I give this soliloquy is, what moment in time did you realize this was your interest and that you wanted to write and put this to paper and express your feelings and thoughts about this, Dan? Do you know that moment? Did it come to you like a light, or was it an ongoing type thing?
Well, as I say, I think that first course at Berea in Appalachian literature was a very pivotal moment. But when I left Berea, even after that course, I didn't even think that I was going to be a teacher at that point. When I graduated from Berea, I did not know, as I was saying earlier, as to where your life takes you. I went back home to North Carolina and worked in a factory. I went to work in a factory for 3 years, and I very easily, if certain things hadn't come along, I could very easily have been working there in that factory today. But as it was, after several years of that, I took a chance. I took a chance, and I decided to move to West Virginia. My roommate from Berea, my college roommate, was living in West Virginia at that time and said, "I can get you a job here, better than the job in this factory that you're working in." And and I'm having a great time. I have lots of friends, and I'm having a wonderful time. So I moved to West Virginia and worked for the West Virginia Department of Welfare. Now, this was an experience. I was going into the country and to visit people who were applying for welfare. And at that time, I really don't think that I sort of identified myself as Appalachian, or was really, even after Berea and even after a course in Appalachian literature, I didn't see myself that way. I really believe that it was not until I came to Cincinnati and saw that there were urban Appalachians, that there were people in this area from the region who had this passion for their roots and for their background, and were fighting really in a way for dignity and appreciation, that I became very interested in my Appalachian background. And it was here at the University of Cincinnati that I began to work on my dissertation, which was on Appalachian women in literature, and became really more interested in the Appalachian region. Since
then, you've published a book, Wingless Flight, and of course all books need a good title, and that has to do with Appalachian women's writings and fiction. You are involved with the Journal of Kentucky Studies. You've edited that and worked with Gary Walton in soliciting contributions to that. You have had contacts with the likes of Gurney Norman and, of course, my good friend Harry Caudle and many, many others. And so it has to be extremely exciting. And we tend to underrate the importance of this body of what I call agrarian Appalachian-type people who see value and intrinsic value here in the story of Appalachia, the soil, and it's really a continuation of what took place down at Vanderbilt in the 30s when you talk about Allen Tate and you talk about Robert Penn Warren. So we're going to have time for just one more question, Danny, and I always like to ask some variation of this question. But when you look back at the things that you've done and the things you hope to do, what is the most important thing to you as an educator, as a person? What is it that you want to put forth to your students, to your colleagues, and state as what you really are all about?
Well, I believe that teaching is the most important aspect of my life. If I can touch one student or get one student to, in years to come, think, wow, I remember that poem, or I remember that story, or that really, or even to recite something, then I will feel that I have made a difference. I think that teaching is the most wonderful career in the world, and I'm very, very happy to be a teacher.
Especially in literature and poetry, you evoke emotion, and no doubt you have people come back and say, I remember what you said in class. I always like to think about writing and about teaching in two references. They both, in many ways, are frightening. We have to put our personality out. We have to show exactly who we are for others to understand. But then there's the reward that when they do understand who we are, they remember who we are and they use that to better themselves. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely do. I think that teaching is the most rewarding career in the world.
Well, Dan, I appreciate you visiting with us today. It's a shame that we only have a half an hour because you and I could probably talk for hours. That's our program for today. I'm certainly glad you could be with us. And be sure to check your schedule for a future edition of Northern Lights. I'm Jim Claypool, and thank you for joining us.